Hi, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. When you think of spring, you think of rejuvenation, revitalization, and that's what Lowell's officials had in mind in the mid-1900s. Here with me to talk about urban development and its implications is UML's Professor Robert Forrant, and I'm Maritza. So, the last we left off, Lowell was a bustling industrial city. Everybody was coming in from all over to get a little piece of that textile pie. But then we see a decline in mill work, and that kind of maybe caused some problems.
Yeah, so the city's doing great just as you describe it through the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. But as early as 1915, mills are actually beginning to close up, just shut down. And there's a little bit of a reprieve during the First World War, but by 1920, many more mills shut down. And between 1920 and 1930, close to 10 of the big mill complexes in the city are completely closed. The city's population drops. We go from, around 110,000 people to under 80,000 people. Work is scarce. At the same time, because work is scarce and people are leaving, we've also, the federal government has closed off immigration. There's an immigration law that's passed in 1924, which severely restricts immigration into the country, so the numbers drop. So the way the Lowell population would usually rejuvenate itself, some people would leave, but there were always next generations of people coming in over the 19th century. That stops too, and so the city is, in many respects, the city is emptying out, both of jobs and of people, because largely people came here because there was work.
Right, and what does that do for a city's economy?
Well, the economy, basically, as one can probably easily imagine, the economy's in the tank. Basically, you've got a lot of empty mills, and because people are leaving, you have lots of older neighborhoods in the city that were built largely for immigrant workers when they were coming into the city. Those neighborhoods are beginning to empty out. They're getting smaller. But more importantly, even than people leaving, is that the landlords, the people who own the buildings, stop investing in them. They stop fixing them up. They stopped modernizing them. Many of the old tenement blocks don't have indoor plumbing still in the 1920s. A lot of them are badly hooked up for electricity. So because the economy is going down, the people who own the buildings think, okay, well, why should we keep investing in the upkeep of our tenement blocks? They disinvest in the tenement blocks begin to get run down. And over the middle couple of decades of the 20th century, between 1920 and 1940, not only are mills closing, but the housing stock in the city is really badly deteriorating.
And this is all like approaching around the Great Depression, right?
The Great Depression, I don't know when, technically people think it starts in 1929. Historians of Lowell actually say Lowell's in the Great Depression by 1925.
Wow.
For all the reasons that we just talked about. But by the middle of the 1930s, the city is in some despair. We have fewer textile workers in the 1930s than we had in the 1830s. Wow. And so the federal government, in the midst of the Great Depression, as a way to try to put people back to work, federal legislation gets passed to make federal dollars available to any city that applies for the money that wants to use it to tear down what the federal government refers to as blighted neighborhoods.
And a blighted neighborhood could just mean the tenements that the landlords aren't taking care of that could easily maybe be rehabilitated.
Right, it could be rehabilitated, or, when you look from the outside and you call something blighted, what you're missing is families live there, generations live there, there's culture, there's schools, there's neighborhood rhythm and life, music, food, all that good stuff, right? And so even though physically, sure, the neighborhood's deteriorating in that sense of, the building could use some paint and some new stairs and whatever it might be, but nonetheless, people live there and there's a vibrancy to daily life. But it becomes easy for cities like Lowell, not just Lowell, Boston does the same thing, Lawrence, all old urban industrial cities partake of this table of getting the money and knocking stuff down. And so Lowell basically approaches this almost like at a fever pitch between like 1940 and about 1970. They're just knocking things down almost as quickly as they can find a steamroller or something to knock the building down.
And which communities were affected the most by this?
Largely the neighborhood that you would suspect in terms of Lowell's history, the oldest neighborhood first. And so the Acre neighborhood, which was the first neighborhood that large numbers of Irish immigrants lived in, then French Canadians, then Greeks thereafter, and then French Canadians spread out into their own neighborhood along the river called Little Canada. But those old, what had been immigrant neighborhoods for 50, 75 years, largely where people are renting as opposed to owning, because people are working in the mills, they don't have enough money yet to get a mortgage and do whatever. And so those are the neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods that are really knocked down first, the first one actually is what's called the Greek Triangle Acre. And so if you're familiar with the city of Lowell at all, it's over in the area where there are Greek restaurants now and things like that. That's sort of the vestiges.
The Hellenic school over
Yeah,
there.
exactly. That's sort of the vestiges of that neighborhood. You've got the Hellenic school, you've got a Greek church, really beautiful gold dome on the top of that church. That neighborhood right there, housing got knocked down there and a few hundred families were displaced, as well as stores, markets, things like that. And largely then in that area where the older housing was knocked down, housing was built for veterans coming back from the Second World War and also for senior housing. So what's referred to in the city as the North Commons area of Lowell, that housing development right in through there was really what came after the old immigrant part of the city was taken down.
So all of these people being displaced, they could not have been overjoyed about this. Were there promises made?
A lot of times there were, and they were actually shady. No big surprise. A lot of times people were sold on the idea that you're going to have to go someplace else for a little while, but then you'll be able to come back. And that wasn't always true. There was another neighborhood near where the Lowell train station is now, which was called Hale Howard, which was a largely Jewish neighborhood. And a little bit later, after the Greek Triangle neighborhood got knocked down, efforts were made to take that neighborhood down, and that happened. And so there were synagogues and other, religious institutions, food stores, delicatessens, markets, the same as housing that were all taken down. A lot of the folks that were affected by that did not come back to Lowell. The religious institutions were moved outside of the city. In some cases, even though the city would say we're going to build housing, they didn't really want to build housing. By the 1960s, the idea was if we can take down some of the old parts of the city, we'll make them attractive for new development, not housing, but factories and jobs, like new high-tech jobs, computer companies, whatever. And so there ultimately becomes these sort of dueling visions of what the city's going to look like. But in the 1960s, the idea is take down old mill buildings, take down a lot of the row houses, the boarding houses that had been built in the 19th century that workers had lived in, clear a lot of space along the river, along the Merrimack, tear a bunch of the mill buildings down, that old mill buildings that are there. And then when all the new high-tech companies along Route 128 and that are spawned by MIT and whatever, it gets too expensive for them to be in Boston, they'll think, oh, we should go to Lowell because there's all this land now that's ready for us to plop ourselves down on. And so that's the vision for a long time, and it doesn't really work. Right. So a lot of the knockdowns are done without necessarily knowing what's going to come in their place. It's like a risk, right? And so the last really big neighborhood that gets knocked down is over by where UMass Lowell is now. That was a neighborhood called Little Canada, and that sprawls on both sides of the Merrimack River. And that was a really big population. I mean, there were several hundred buildings, stores, markets, same thing again, churches, all sorts of cultural activity, and that was really, knocking that one down really got the most people the most upset. because it really was traumatic in the sense that it was sitting right there in the middle of the city, and it was a really big and a thriving neighborhood, and it was done in a really trying to think of the right adjective to use. It was done in, I'll call it heinous, for lack of a better term, and popping up in my brain. But they basically sort of went street by street, knocking buildings down, and then lighting the rubble from knocking the buildings down on fire. And there were still people living in the neighborhood, so they kind of went block by block by block through the neighborhood. And so this was a really, I mean, I can't imagine if I was a kid, 5, 6, 7 years old, and I'm watching all the houses where my friends used to play, that I used to go over and hang out with, and now bulldozers knocking them down and it's getting lit on fire. It's like, where are we? What kind of place is this? And so there were really beautiful tenements, and some of the buildings were actually in pretty good shape, but they were still all taken down. And again, not with an idea of what actually was going to go in the place. Eventually, that's where the university pretty dramatically expands. A lot of dormitories, again, for people that are familiar with the city, if you've come or if you're from outside the city and you're watching, but if you come into a hockey game at the Songus Arena, or you go to a minor league Red Sox game, the Lowell Spinners, at LeLacheur Park, that whole area is where, that was Little Canada. That was the area where everything got knocked down, and that's where the most of UMass's dorms are now for undergraduate students.
And I bet people have no idea. When all of these communities are being dispersed, where do they go? So some leave the city, but some stay. But now these general communities, they're completely spread out.
Right. The sort of the notion of these immigrant neighborhoods, with all the vibrancy that they bring in terms of culture and language, and Little Canada had several French language newspapers, and there were people who were interviewed who spoke just French.
Wow.
Right? I mean, we're all the time now, like, we're always like, not you or I, but generally people are like anxious, right? How come you don't learn English?
Right.
Well, lots of people didn't.
Exactly. They didn't have to.
Right? I mean, my grandma spoke Italian and a little bit of English, but she lived in a part of Philadelphia where Italian was spoken, right? And so it was the same way here. So there were people that lived in Little Canada. There was the hospital that's not there anymore, St. Joseph's Hospital, where University Crossing is now. That hospital actually recruited French-speaking nurses from Quebec to come and work with the population that would use the hospital, because they felt like that way French-speaking patients would get the best care.
That's inclusive, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely inclusive, before we knew the word inclusive, right? And so, so a lot of people that were affected left, as you said before, but other people stayed. So Pawtucketville, the area on the other side of the river, that's almost like sometimes you feel like you're not in Lowell anymore when you're out in, it's like you're not in Kansas anymore. It's like you're way out there. But the Pawtucketville neighborhood grows because a lot of housing developments are going to be being built in the 1960s and the 1970s. There's a lot of land out there to build on. Over on the Centerville side of the river, up what's called Christian Hill, that whole neighborhood gets built up more, so some people can move over there. And so in some cases it's like second and third generation of people that historically would have lived in the Greek neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhood, and the French Canadian neighborhood. They stayed, but in other cases people left. So there was another whole project over off Center Street, this whole area that's basically they make into a shopping plaza. And that neighborhood is knocked down. That's largely a Portuguese, Lithuanian, Polish, really a very mixed neighborhood, Italian.
Armenians.
Armenian as well, right? I mean, that's like this really interesting neighborhood with all sorts of folks living in it. That gets knocked down for a Stop and Shop and a Zayre's department store. I don't even think Zayre's exists anymore. But it basically is like almost in the middle of the city, like a strip mall. And that's where the Weird Road is built. Right?
Yeah.
So if you're ever coming into Lowell and you're on the Lowell Connector, and you wonder, why does it just like end right in front of these poor people's houses, right? And how
Always
many
wondered
times
that.
have people smashed into the wall
Gosh.
in front of that house? That the connector was part of urban renewal. And so the vision was you could come off of Route 495 or Route 3, get on the connector, and snake your way around the city so you'd never have to go into the downtown proper. So the connector was supposed to go right through that neighborhood where it ends, go straight through there, and if you can imagine, come out around where Middlesex Community College's building is now, where the Lowell Auditorium is, onto Merrimack Street, and then you could go out onto Pawtucket Boulevard and go out the other way, like out Drum Hill that way, back out onto Route 3.
Wow.
And so the idea was, again, connected to bringing all this industry in, people could just loop around on this high-speed sort of, road around the city of Lowell and never have to come downtown, never have to see anybody living in the city of Lowell. And so ultimately, so a big stretch of it obviously got built, but people by this point, by the late 60s, early 70s, people had gotten tired of having their neighborhoods torn up by one development project after another, and a neighborhood group formed in that neighborhood basically to put political pressure on the Lowell City Council and decision makers in the city to say, okay, the road stops. We've had enough of this. And ultimately they're able to get enough votes in the city council for their, ultimately, when the debate is held to extend the road, the people that want the road extended, like WCAP, the Lowell Sun, the power brokers of Lowell, they want this road built. But the neighborhood rises up, and it's a 6-3 vote in the city council to stop the road from being built. Nonetheless, the damage in a way is done because the road does cut right through what had been neighborhoods.
Right.
And it kind of stops in this really crazy way, which definitely affects all the traffic right there as well, and makes for a real nice bottleneck at 5 p.m.
Oh yeah.
When you're trying to get back home from work or whatever. So it's not as though, I mean, the first 2 or 3 projects, like the Greek Triangle Acre, people are upset, they try to fight it. Hale Howard, people are upset. But by the time of the connector, people have finally had enough. And then you really see community organization, and you see the development of neighborhood groups. You see the Coalition for a Better Acre get formed out of all of this. And so ultimately the federal government decides that if we're going to do urban renewal, urban redevelopment, whatever we want to call it, we have to have neighbors, we have to have the neighborhoods engaged in the process. And so they say, we're not going to give this kind of money anymore just willy-nilly to any city to knock down whatever they feel like. You have to have neighborhood input, neighborhood participation, and out of that comes in Lawrence something called Lawrence Community Works, and in Lowell something called the Coalition for a Better Acre. So these neighborhood organizations grow up out of the sort of this contest over who's going to decide what the city looks like.
Wow, so even dispersing all of the communities are like, no, we're going to still band together, and our voices are going to be heard, which is still reminiscent now of how all of these wonderful community organizations work together.
Yep, and a lot of it comes out of the angst of this sort of this pressure to knock everything down.
Right.
And I mean, it's fascinating when you look at the history, because we think now of Lowell as like the national park and all the rest of it, but this is before the park. And so the idea that a lot of people have to do economic development in the city is the only way we're going to move forward is actually to get rid of the history. That the history is holding us back. That all these old mill buildings and the tenement blocks and the row houses and the boarding houses, all of that stuff, the trolleys, everything is holding back Lowell from becoming a modern city. And so for a while, what takes the lead is let's just get rid of the history. And so there's even, at one point, the Harvard Design School comes to Lowell. They've come up with this, what now seems like the most bizarre plan one could ever imagine. I actually went and looked at the blueprints for it at the Harvard Design School when I was doing more work on the history of all of this. They actually had proposed to create a dome over the city, like from Market Street out to Merrimack, to create like a half dome over the city and create an urban mall
Oh my goodness.
where there would be no traffic like in the area where Merrimack, Middle, and Market are, like that sort of from Dutton and Central Street.
Wow.
Right? And there would be like this dome over it, and then the mills along where the boot mill is now, and where Jackson Street is, where all those mills are, all those mills would be torn down, and it would create 10,000 parking spaces.
Oh, wonderful! Just what we need.
And so that's what the city would have looked like. It would have been like this really, I don't know, plastic bubble over the downtown, and then space for 10,000 cars. And again, the connector would have fed people into the the parking lots. And imagine how weird that would have looked, right?
Preposterous.
And so there was big debate, discussion.
Right.
There was a model of this made that people could see on view at City Hall. I mean, this was, people actually thought.
Wow, there was a lot of buy-in for it.
Yeah, people thought about doing this. And then roughly around this, a little bit later, but roughly around the same time, people from MIT and other people in the city got together and started toying with the idea of an urban national historical park. And then that caught fire, thankfully, for me at least as a history teacher, and for this building, which is still here. The idea of the park got more and more sway. And then at the same time as the park idea is coming along, people begin to also pull back from knocking stuff down. And then once the idea of the park comes along, the idea of just continually knocking things down sort of goes by the boards. And so there's a little bit more of that, because there are some buildings that just literally can't be saved. But now, at least in the confines of where the National Historical Park's footprint is, stuff is being preserved, fixed, kept in sort of the condition it would have looked like in the 19th century. But for I mean, I imagine what it would have looked like with this. And again, it was because while all this is going on, right, while all the urban renewal we're talking about is going on, what's also happening in the downtown of cities like Lowell or Lawrence or Haverhill or other Milton, Manchester, New Hampshire, Nashua, whatever, is malls are being built, highways are being built, and malls are being built.
Wow.
And so basically you get the growth of suburbs and you get the growth of these gigantic malls.
Right.
And so people think the only way maybe to save Lowell's downtown is affect in some way the shopping commercial experience by creating a lot of free parking, right, by knocking the mill buildings down and creating this indoor shopping experience of what an enclosed mall would look like. And so this becomes the possibility. I mean, they actually do build something like this in Worcester.
Wow.
That ultimately ends up failing, and it's been torn down. They built something similar in Lawrence that ultimately gets knocked down. So cities do this. Some of them actually take the cheese and sort of do this. But Boston's another good case. Boston, the whole area of what was called the West End of Boston, which was largely an immigrant neighborhood, around now where Mass General Hospital is, for people familiar with that part of Boston, on the backside of Beacon Hill, that whole area all gets knocked down, and we end up with that crazy looking Boston City Hall.
Oh, yeah.
And City Hall Plaza, which is probably one of the most awful architectural
Wonders.
Whatever it is, architectural failure of epic.
Yeah.
And that whole desolate place in front of it. Whoever
Right.
thought that was gonna. But if you go to other places, if you go to Albany, if you go to Syracuse, if you go to Buffalo, there's something similar in all these places, because what happens is these design people think they have the solution, and then everybody wants to rush to get the solution. Right? They all drink the Kool-Aid or whatever, and they go, oh, we got to do this, we got to do this. So that's what happens here. And I think most people that live in the city now, like people that have come into the city more recently, newer immigrant and refugee groups and whatever, don't know like this whole sort of history. And the other thing for me is the city prides itself on like its immigrant past.
Right.
But yet you can see from what we've just been talking about, we've basically wiped out 3 really vibrant immigrant neighborhoods in this sort of historical process from 1940 to roughly around 1975 or so. It kind of stops.
Right.
And I don't know. I imagine like that area where East Campus of the university is. If the university hadn't grown and expanded in that area, I'd try to figure out what would be there. I can't imagine that you would just knock something as an area as big as that down today without knowing what you were going to put in its place.
With lack of foresight and lack of real planning and community buy-in, which is so crucial, I feel like, because your community is your economy. And all those businesses that were lost, and this is what we have now, but now we have our history is preserved a little bit at least. And I feel like we're so lucky for that, to be able to go down to the boot mills and learn about everything there, and even being, like you said, in this historical building. I think that we're pretty lucky that there was a big giant halt and people were like, nope, we're not going to do this anymore.
Well, ultimately cooler heads prevailed, right? And it's like, okay, wait, we have to think of a more, and now you think of places like Mill Number 5 in the city where you do have almost like a urban retail, you have an urban inside retail space, which is much more eclectic, much more interesting, much more in the fabric of sort of Lowell remaking itself.
And we didn't have to knock it down.
And you didn't have to knock it down, and it's much more attractive and interesting than a plastic bubble dome over, over a bunch of streets.
Every time I picture that, I'm just so grossed out.
Yeah, and I had to, that's why I went to Harvard to find because I had to, had to see, okay, what's the deal?
And who thought this was a good idea?
Right. I thought Harvard, it sort of lowered, I mean, not that I think Harvard thinks they're the smartest place in the world. I never thought that. But that some genius there thought that this was a good idea.
Right.
It sort of really made me think, yeah, you guys aren't all that smart. That this was the option. But I think now, I mean, it would be impossible now, and nor is there the money anymore. Right? I mean, but the trade-off is we really lack any kind of an urban federal policy now in terms of building better transportation, all the sort of things that a city like Lowell really could use. The sort of abandonment. So there's this phase of knocking everything down in these older cities, and then once you've knocked it all down, walk away and let everybody fend for themselves in an environment, again, where the downtowns are emptying out because of malls and highways. And because, I mean, Lowell's retail, Merrimack, Middle, Market, Central Street, all of that existed because people lived in neighborhoods where they could walk.
Exactly.
Right? And so people didn't have cars. You walked downtown. You walked to the grocery store. People didn't think about putting 20 bags of groceries in the back of their car. You routinely went. I mean, if you, again, in terms of a place to sort of see like a vestige of what it looked like would be, in terms of Little Canada, would be Cody's.
Wow.
Right?
Which is still
Cody's
there,
Market, right? Which was always there. And that was the kind of market that would be, these would be dotted all over the neighborhood.
Wow.
That's, that's a survivor.
Incredible.
And so, yeah, I mean, people still drive in from the suburbs on Saturday to get French Canadian beans, right, from Cody's, right? And, and so it's the beans are legendary. But that's a legacy of, of the area. St. Joseph's Hospital, was closed, and then the university knocked it down. So that connection has been severed. I mean, I'm not sure my students have asked me, like, well, what would you put in its place? It's a tricky question, right? Because again, everything's happening badly at once. We had youth builds then, they could have probably bought, or had CBA been around then, Coalition for Better Acre, because that's partly what they do. They now will take those similar structures and completely, rehabilitate them and turn them into really beautiful housing.
So we've lost some history, but we've gained some really good insight, and some wonderful things came out of it, these community organizations. And I think that community working together is the overarching theme in a lot of what we talk about throughout history. If communities didn't work together, we wouldn't move forward.
We'd be in way worse shape.
Oh, definitely. So thank you for tuning in today, and we'll be back with more History on Lowell.